They cost $10 billion to prepare. They will feature more than 6,000 athletes from 50 nations competing in 30 sporting events, and they were intended to be an opportunity to showcase Azerbaijan to the world. But the first ever European Games, which kick off in Baku on Friday, have also put a bright spotlight on Azerbaijan's spotty human rights record. Hello from our broadcast headquarters in Prague, and welcome to RFARL Live. My name is Brian Whitmore, host of the Power Vertical podcast. Joining me here in Prague is Kenan Aliyev, executive editor of Current Time, a Russian-language news program run by RFARL and Voice of America. Welcome, Kenan.
Thank you.
And joining us from Budapest is journalist and blogger Arzu Gaybula, who has written extensively about political prisoners in Azerbaijan, particularly about the case of jailed investigative journalist Hadija Ismailova. Welcome, Arzu.
Thank you.
And joining us from Arlington, Virginia is Richard Kozlarich, former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan as well as to Bosnia-Herzegovina, and currently an adjunct professor at George Mason University. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
And we're glad to have you. And joining us also from Washington, D.C. is David Kramer, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs and currently Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy at the McCain Institute. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Brian.
Well, Kenan, let's get the ball rolling with you. I mean, regimes like Azerbaijan love these big spectacles, so to speak. But whenever they host them, whenever the focus inevitably turns to things they'd rather avoid. Questions of human rights, questions of corruption, questions of the human cost of construction. And every time this happens, I wonder, what is in this for Azerbaijan? Why does Azerbaijan want to host this event that's bringing so much negative publicity to it?
I think this is very important questions, and I think one of the main reasons here, because Azerbaijan wants prestige, wants recognition, and wants respectability on the international arena, but it wants it on its own terms. Mm-hmm. The way, what we witnessed, for example, in Sochi, when Putin hosted these events, when there were a lot of talks about human rights issues, domestic issues, political repressions, and stuff like that. But the response usually from the government and from the organizers of this event that please don't mix the politics with the sports. Most of Azeris, if you ask them, of course they would love to host this kind of events and see, Azerbaijan on the international stage. Azeris, like me, we like sports, we like be athletic and stuff like that. But the cost of these events are much higher than it is presented, and it's about human cost. It's about actual cost of this event. Just today, we just got the news that, for example, Netherlands decided not to host the next event, which is scheduled for 2019. They said we cannot afford $65 million. Mm-hmm. But the cost of this event for Azerbaijan is now almost more than $1 billion officially, and unofficially there is allegations that it's around $8 billion. Mm-hmm. So, but I think then it's about prestige, it's about recognition. But unfortunately, the legacy of these games will be that authoritarian regimes can win the prestige on the expense of the sporting events, and that's actually the bad message for the future of the sport and future of Azerbaijan.
You mentioned Sochi, and I'm glad you did, because I could see the point with something like Sochi. It's the Olympics, for God's sakes, right? With the Olympics, with the World Cup, I could see Putin making the calculation. We're going to get some negative publicity, but once the Olympics start, it's the biggest show in the world, and it's going to be all positive, and it was, if you remember. But back to the Sochi Olympics, with something like this, a lower profile event, I find it hard to see the pluses in it, unless this is an attempt later to get something bigger like the Olympics.
Well, I think there will be a desire on the part of the Azeri government after hosting these events go after the Olympic Games. And we can discuss about the chances of getting it or not. But I think on the smaller scale, at least on a European scale, Azerbaijani authorities, and especially the president and his family, they're desperately looking for recognition. They're looking for to be on the world stage, to be on the CNN, to be on the big screen, and to say, we are here, and despite all the criticism of our record, you know, having people in jail, having journalists in jail, having newspapers and radio stations shut down at home, we're still hosting this event and we are recognized. And basically it's buying their own fame on international stage. And the critics of this event pointing out that, you know, international sporting federations, they should be careful in awarding countries like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, which is also bidding for
the
next
Olympics,
Winter Games, Russia, which is hosting the World Cup, and there is a lot of controversy surrounding FIFA and other international organizations which are accused of corruption, that you should be careful, because the message of sport is not just you know, being there for the sake of being there and pleasing these regimes, but also sending a strong message to organizers that you have to play by rules.
And I want to get into this as we go on, is that there's this tendency for these events to go to authoritarian governments. And we see Azerbaijan's hosting this. The Dutch have decided they don't want to host it. I want to remind our viewers, if you want to join the discussion, you can send us a message on Twitter at hashtag RFERLIVE. And I wanted to also note that Amnesty International has been banned from this. A British human rights activist was detained at the Baku airport yesterday. So this is only putting a bright shining spotlight on the human rights situation more. I wanted to ask both David and Richard to address this question. Does Azerbaijan get a kind of de facto free pass on human rights issues due to its strategic importance in the conflict with Russia, due to its role as a major energy supplier? To paraphrase former President Eisenhower, can we say, you know, Aliyev might be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch? Is this what's happening with Azerbaijan right now? Either of you, I'd like to hear from either David or Richard on this, since you're both experienced in these matters.
Well, maybe if I could just go back to this prestige point, because it ties into this. You know, prestige carries with it scrutiny, both from the people of your own country and from the outside world. And so the desire to have prestige you know, runs counter to people like Amnesty International and the journalists you mentioned having free access to report on what's going on in Azerbaijan. I don't agree that that President Aliyev you know, belongs somehow to the United States and therefore, you know, has a pass on human rights issues. You know, I think it's quite to the contrary. But I think he would like us to believe that because of the things that you mentioned, therefore we would look the other way and not pay any attention to the human rights abuses and the suppression of freedom of expression that's going on in Azerbaijan. And I think the problems in our relationship today, the bilateral relationship between the United States and Azerbaijan, can be traced directly to the fact that Americans individually and as a government have spoken out about these abuses. Whether we're happy or not with the degree to which the U.S. government has spoken out is another issue, but it has had an impact. So I don't think he gets a free pass, and I don't think in any respect that somehow the United States has a particular relationship with the president of Azerbaijan that would sort of fit into Eisenhower's category.
David, your thoughts?
I'd offer perhaps a little more critical view than Rich of the U.S. government. I think this is true of Republican or Democratic administrations. It hasn't particularly mattered. It's either been because Azerbaijan is important for energy, or it's important for security purposes with Afghan transit, or it's because it's sandwiched between Iran and Russia. And so we're looking at it from a largest geostrategic position. I don't think the U.S. government has been sufficiently outspoken about what has been an abysmal deterioration in human rights in Azerbaijan, particularly in the past year and a half, almost 2 years now. You had the postponement, cancellation. It's not quite clear to me what happened with the visit last month that was supposed to have taken place by the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Tom Malinovsky, who was going to launch a new dialogue on civil society with Azerbaijani authorities and with civil society activists. That trip was canceled. So we don't even seem to be talking very much about these issues. If you look at the statement that the U.S. issued on the occasion of Azerbaijan's Republic Day by Secretary Kerry, a press statement, there's no mention of human rights. There's no mention of the deteriorating situation inside Azerbaijan. So we may be saying things more privately and behind closed doors, but the public messaging so far, I think, has given the impression that we're not paying sufficient attention to what's happening on the ground.
Would you say that that's because the geopolitics is trumping the human rights issue?
I'm not quite sure. I think it's for a bunch of the reasons I mentioned: the energy, geostrategic, its location, security. But we just haven't been outspoken, whatever the reason is. And again, it's Republican, Democrat. So this is not a partisan critique. I think it's more a critique of the U.S. government as a whole. But you do have, certainly in the United States, but also in Europe, a stronger mobilization of civil society organizations. Rich and I and others are part of a group here in Washington that's been pushing on these issues. We were part of an open letter to President Aliyev as well as to Secretary of State Kerry, raising the profile of these issues. So we're doing what we can, but it has to be a public-private partnership, civil society and Western governments, in pressing the government in Baku to improve its record.
I want to go to you, Arzu, see if your thoughts on this. You blog quite a bit, probably more than most, if not anybody, about these issues of human rights in Azerbaijan. What do you see happening on the ground as Azerbaijan prepares for these games? Has the situation gotten worse? Has it stayed the same? Has it gotten better in any way? How are these games affecting the human rights situation there on the ground?
Well, we could just start with the basic limitations of these European games on the citizens. I mean, putting aside the human rights issues, just in the list of restrictions that the government has imposed because of the European games, like the very basic things, like not hanging clothes outside on the balcony because the balcony is facing the main street, or changing the shifts, work shifts that people normally have, not letting people enter the city if they're driving an old Soviet car. I mean, why would you limit a person and what means of transportation that person is using, or limiting the transportation of those who are actually using buses to come in outside of the neighboring towns who actually come to Baku for work. And, you know, putting aside human rights, I mean, you're already violating the rights of your citizens, and you're already violating their normal work and life schedules with just these restrictions. Or, for example, not being able to host a wedding or not bury your dead ones. I mean, it's as basic as this. And then you look at the human rights situations, and that's even worse, because then you have, you know, very clear cases of rights violations, of people being silenced. And if you go through some of the I guess satirical or humoristic ways people talk about these European games, it's like, you know, they're limiting the rights of people to speak. They're limiting the rights of people to share their grievances, and it's widespread. But the government is trying to suppress this. They've employed a number of trolls and Twitter users who constantly argue against everything that you say and talk about these double standards, and that is not true. These European games are the most important thing that has ever happened, that it's a celebration, it's a holiday worth celebrating with open arms. And it's a very it's a huge contradiction of what the government obviously says and what the government supporters say, and then what people have to deal with every day.
Well, this gets to something also I wanted to get into here. I remember being in St. Petersburg when they hosted the Goodwill Games. Remember those when they used to exist? Yeah. I was in St. Petersburg, and the feeling of the locals was very, very mixed. On one hand, there was this pride that the city was hosting these games, but people felt really put out, and it really wasn't that fun to be in the city at that time, just because of the way former Soviet countries tend to do security, so to speak. What are you hearing, both Kenan and Arzu? What are you hearing on the ground? I mean, is there this pride in having the games among ordinary Azeris, people that maybe aren't involved in the human rights movement and aren't politicized? Are they?
I think there is basically mixed feelings. I mean, this is a young nation. It's a growing, let's say, economy. It's an oil-producing nation, and there is feeling of pride on some parts of Azeris who see this event as an opportunity to be, to host the guests, to show the best of the country, and Azeris, you guys been both in Azerbaijan. They're very hospitable people, and they like having guests at home. And but the questions, which many people asking, and many people who are raising these questions now in jail, and in preparations for these games, we had unprecedented crackdown. We have almost no independent media left in Azerbaijan. We have political activists sitting in jail. Leyla Yunus, this 60 years old human rights activist, who called for the boycott of these games, now she's in jail. And she's been in jail without trial. And they decided to extend her stay in jail for until after the games. And we have Khadija Ismail, Arif Yarel, contributor and journalist, investigative journalist, who raised the questions about the cost of this event, and how much this stadium cost, how much the game will cost. She's in jail. And everyone who actually, because it's not the first international game Azerbaijan is hosting, a few years ago Azerbaijan hosted Eurovision games. And that time there also were a lot of questions how much this game cost to Azerbaijani budget. So, and anyone who is actually critical of these games or raising questions about the cost, about the human rights, about political freedoms, end up in jail. So government created situation where we have, criticism-free environment around this game. And this is the fact why they're not letting international human rights group enter Azerbaijan during this game. They selected the journalists, they checked their backgrounds, international journalists, before they awarded them accreditation. So why? What is their government is trying to hide from the international community if this is such an open event? But again, feelings are mixed. Yes, it creates a lot of kind of pressure on the people who live in that area of the games. Some people see this as an opportunity for Azerbaijan. For some people, it's even business. I mean, one good news today I heard about this game, that finally, after 15 years, now there is a direct bus from the Baku airport to downtown Baku. It took 15 years. We had to host the games.
There certainly wasn't one last time I was in Baku.
And it cost 1 manat, which is almost €1.
Wow.
Because for 15 years, if you arrive to Baku airport, there is no bus taking you to the city. So there is some positives. Let's be not completely negative. But of course, the questions which we are trying to raise here, and in Azerbaijan, ordinary Azeris raising these questions. And one of the biggest problems was about, for example, there was a tragedy just a month ago when the whole housing complex burned down because it was part of the beautification project, and during
12 people died, right?
12 to 16 people died, and many people got injured, just because for beautification project they used the cheap plastic, very easily inflammable materials, and there was a debate: or should we,
wait for the end of the European Games?
Wait for the end of European Games to address this problem, or should we do it before the European Games? So I mean, people die because of the stupidity of certain government officials. And the president knows about that. So feelings are mixed, and I think there will be more questions as these games kick in. And the biggest question remains: will the crackdown on civil society, on human rights activists, on international organizations? Let's not forget, 2 days ago, OECD being kicked out of Azerbaijan, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
Of which Azerbaijan is a member.
So will it continue? Will this game serve as a kind of carte blanche for the regime to continue this, or maybe it will change some positive.
Brian, can I jump in?
Yes,
just
of course.
a few points. First, the OSCE office in Baku has been given a month to get out. This is a few months before parliamentary elections will take place in Azerbaijan, so the timing is clearly no coincidence. But there are other cities around the world where there are groups that try to host the Olympics. My hometown of Boston, Massachusetts is one, where it was selected by the U.S. Olympic Committee as one of the candidates to host, I think it's the 2022 Olympics, and it has generated some strong popular backlash. People don't want it. Those who have ever been in Boston, they know there's enough traffic and congestion as it is. They don't need Olympics to add to it. Nobody's been arrested, thrown in jail, or anything like that for speaking out against the Boston candidacy for the International Olympics. In Azerbaijan, the opposite happens. Anyone who speaks out against the government is targeted, whether you're an Azerbaijani or you're an international citizen. And that's why the person from Amnesty and another British organization has been banned. The other point, though, I just want to raise, you were asking earlier why Azerbaijan gets a pass. It's corruption. I don't think with the U.S. government, but there is a lot of money spent here in Washington on lobbyists and others to put the best face forward for the Azerbaijani government. Gerald Knaus has put out yet another terrific report, or I guess an essay in the Journal of Democracy, in which he talks about the end of shame, about how the Council of Europe and other European organizations have essentially been bought off by Azerbaijani money. This is happening, keep in mind, at a time when the government has fewer resources at its disposal as a result of the decline in the price of oil. So for all the money it's spending on this, including paying for all the athletes to participate and come, that the government is going to have a lot fewer dollars or whatever currency it's using when this is all over.
Could I add?
Richard, I'd like to get you in here.
Yeah, I think this is really an important point. I think the whole focus, as the government has placed on the idea of increasing prestige, is going to backfire. It's going to backfire because going with that is going to be the unwanted attention now growing because of the banning of Amnesty International, the closing of the OSCE office, and cutting off foreign journalists who are necessary to tell the story that Azerbaijan wants to the outside world. When these games end, people are going to have to come back to reality. And I think it's good that David pointed out the economic side to this. But this issue of corruption, we've seen it in the FIFA case. We've seen it in the case of other international events, sporting and otherwise. And I think at some point, they don't care what the U.S. says or does now. But people are going to start asking questions about why spend this kind of money on this kind of event when it's all over. We still confront the same problems that we have. We have a society that is divided, and voices of difference are shut down. I think this is going to be a very it's going to be a downer after the games are over, and to see how Azerbaijan, having promoted these events so much, both domestically and internationally, deals with the consequences.
I want to pick up.
I just quickly add, Brian, just very quickly on Rich's point. They're building new stadium that, what are they going to use them for after this is over? They're going to be like dinosaurs that will go unused, although they will remind people in Azerbaijan, what was that for? Why did we spend some precious resources at a time when we have fewer on these things just for a prestige gambit? I agree with Rich.
That's an excellent point, because they built this the palace, Crystal Palace, for the Eurovision, and to my knowledge, it had been used only a few times since then, but it cost almost $100 million. And but I think maybe they can.
But that was when the price of oil was higher, though.
Yeah, it's much higher.
I think Azerbaijan may host these games every year. If nobody's going to pick up this
Every 4 years you wanted to say, Kenan, right? Not every
Well,
year.
it can go even every year because I mean there is now Islamic games also coming
Yes.
lined up.
And the
There
Formula
will be
One.
Formula One is coming next year. I mean, again, but as you pointed out, the corruption is a big question. Who benefits from these constructions, and what? And it's also not corruption on the local level. I think investigative journalism. This is the perfect place for it in Azerbaijan. And unfortunately, some of our colleagues in jail because of that, including Khadija Ismail, that who benefits on Azeri side, but who benefits from the organizer sides and people who actually running the show, you know, and the committee wasn't based in Baku, it was based in London. I mean, I'm not making allegations here, but a lot of groups who are interested in organizing, hosting, and running this kind of events. And this is raising big questions since Azerbaijan is not doing well on the corruption rating around the world.
That's
And if I may add to that, Brian, Azerbaijan not doing really well on corruption index. So today there was an article in one of the pro-government media outlets criticizing BBC for exposing the amount spent on the European Games and criticizing Azerbaijani government policy towards human rights issues. And so the paper cited Pan-American Games in Canada and the past Olympic Games in London, showing the amounts that were spent on these games. And I think this kind of views into this whole Azerbaijani government's understanding of prestige only goes hand in hand when it's about the amount of money spent on international events and how it looks, because the prestige is not understood in the context of everything that falls into prestige, you know, like respecting human rights, like being a democracy, abiding by democratic requirements. It only, the level of prestige is only measured on this level, and this is how they like to compare themselves, or at least show how equal they are. And that's why they were calling on the UK and calling on Canada, yet they're completely oblivious to the fact that, or maybe they forgot intentionally, that Canada is only number 10 on corruption index, UK is only number 14 on corruption index, and Azerbaijan is number 126.
Well, I wanted to pick up on this point of that these sporting events there's this trend for them to go to authoritarian states. I want to read a quote that just blew my mind when I read it. This is from FIFA Secretary General Jerome Valska. He says, I will say something crazy. Less democracy is sometimes better for organizing the World Cup. Now, we mentioned the Sochi Olympics. Belarus hosted the World Hockey Championships recently. Amazingly, Turkmenistan, which is mostly desert, hosted the windsurfing World Cup. And Kazakhstan is, of course, right now bidding for the Winter Olympics, and some people think it has a really good chance of getting the Winter Olympics. You have to wonder, though, as this trend continues, I kept thinking of the counterpoint to all this, and that's the 1988 the Olympics in Seoul. In 1988, those Olympics basically energized the democracy movement in South Korea. South Korea was not a democracy in 1988, and those Olympics energized the democracy movement, and in the opinion of a lot of people, led to the democratization of that country. Can this trend, and I want to go to everybody with this, can this trend of awarding, and it's an unmistakable trend right now, because let's face it, democratic countries don't want to organize these things because the cost, human cost and the monetary cost is just getting too high. Can this trend of awarding these big sporting events to authoritarian countries lead to political change, or am I ridiculously idealistic? Anybody?
Well, I think one thing, like these games, like in Eurovision, when Azerbaijan hosted Eurovision, it brought a lot of international attention to the situation in Azerbaijan. You know, if you read any article related to these games, you know, there is always mention of the human rights situation. There's mention of Khadija, there's mention of political prisoners, which government denies. So in that light, because we live in such a, you know, the world of, you know, communication, like you cannot hide this. You can host this big event, you can put caviar on table, open champagne, you know, excellent Azeri food, but still these issues will be discussed. And I see the positive of this game for the plight of free press and human rights in Azerbaijan from that perspective. Will it lead to any change in the country, political change or reforms? It remains to be seen. The government has a total control over the information space, political space. There is very little room for debate, discussions, especially in the year of parliamentary elections. And I think the government message from hosting this event, that we have carte blanche. See, okay, there was some criticism, there was some, Merkel didn't come, okay, Putin is coming, fine. So we're still a player in the big game. At least that's how they feel. And that's how the message they will get from this. But of course, there is also a big message for the international community, for the local groups who are advocating for the change. They hope that this attention to their plight, to the conditions in the country, appalling conditions in the country, may lead to some kind of pressure from outside which is potentially may bring some change. Because internally, it's very hard to make it happen right now.
There's two things that can happen. They can create pressure internally and externally. Because the human cost of these games, let's face it, are going to get some people angry, and the outside pressure, the attention you mentioned, I don't think. We're not going to see. I think Seoul was probably the exception.
But
it might. But it's something that actually you could. It's not going to happen at an event at the level of the European Games right now. It's not going to happen at an event at the level of Eurovision. But you get talking about the Olympics, the World Cup. Then you could start to see something, and that's what happened in Seoul. David, Richard, I'd like to hear from each of you on this. Can this tendency, and not just in Azerbaijan, we're talking about there's a lot of authoritarian regimes that are getting these marquee sporting events right now. I mentioned.
They tend to be the ones who are willing to pay the money to host them. Maybe the FIFA guy is right. If you've got an authoritarian government, decision-making gets a little more focused, and resources are not an issue, and you don't have to justify to the citizens of Boston why you're going to ruin their life for the sporting event. But I would be a little careful in terms of believing that somehow there's a kind of a positive benefit to come out of these events in terms of addressing the issues that we've been talking about. What I worry about, and I welcome the attention that has been given to the human rights situation because of the games. We spend more time talking about the event itself rather than how do we get those 100 political prisoners freed, or what do we do to advance a free and independent media, or what do we do to make sure that the OSCE office remains in Baku? In a way, it's kind of a distraction from that, because we sometimes spend more time talking about, and the cost of the event is one thing, the disruptions that it causes for the people is another thing, but we're talking about that and not about the problem itself, which is the reason I think that Azerbaijan is getting this attention. Anyway, just one last point: the Azerbaijanis, if they want prestige, they gotta be able to stand the attention that's coming from events like this and some of the things that are going on in European countries in particular. So can't let them off the hook there.
David, your thoughts? Seoul an exception or a harbinger?
I think Seoul is absolutely the exception. All the others that you listed, Brian, while albeit not Olympic Games necessarily, no improvement has occurred in Belarus, Turkmenistan, or the other places you cited. And it suggests to me that these sport events, these gatherings, are not an impetus for democratic change. You have the heads of these organizations, whether it's FIFA or the International Olympic Committee, I don't even know who runs the European Olympics, saying you have to separate sports from politics. So when there are protests about Russia hosting the World Cup in 2018 or Qatar hosting it in 2022, the heads of these organizations say, no, we don't want to interfere in the political situation. So you have people actually arguing against using these sporting events to try to promote positive political change. But the other point I would just make, Brian, is if there is going to be an external push for change, it requires a political will to do so, and that is missing. During our chat, I was sent 2 statements that the State Department issued in April about 2 political prisoners, and it's great that the State Department issued those, and I appreciate the work that went into getting those statements out. I know it wasn't easy, but they were done in the name of the acting deputy spokeswoman. The statement that was issued recognizing Azerbaijan's Republic Day was issued in the name of the Secretary of State, and so in Baku they're going to look at who says these things, and the statement by Kerry is going to outweigh any statement that a deputy press spokesman is going to say. So it does matter at the level we raise this. It matters about the political will, and it matters about our ability to sustain the pressure in order to push for these changes while recognizing there's growing anti-American sentiment in Baku, anti-Western sentiment, and it's because they can get away with it. They're not paying a price for this, and it's why I and others have argued it's time for sanctions against officials responsible for these gross human rights abuses.
David, I agree with you on that point, but what really intrigues me in all this, and let's accept your characterization of the weakness of the U.S. government's response. Why do they get so excited about even that? I mean, I saw a press story not too long ago. The new American ambassador in Azerbaijan met with an opposition political figure, and he's attacked in the press. There's something that I'm not getting here. That causes the kind of reaction that we're seeing and feeding this, as you correctly point out, this anti-American, anti-Western rhetoric, which contrasts completely, by the way, with the rhetoric that they're putting out about the European Games and showing Azerbaijan as a leading country in Europe. There's something I'm totally missing.
David, beyond these protocol things that you mentioned in terms of who the statement was in sanctions, what would you like to see the Western countries and the United States doing here to address these issues?
Oh, I instead of issuing rather banal statements on Republic Day, I'd rather have the Secretary of State calling out the government on its human rights abuses. I'd rather see U.S. officials, but also European officials. I don't by any means want to let Europe off the hook on this. See them speak out much more and actually do something. If we say these arrests are unacceptable, what are we going to do so that we don't accept it? Otherwise, we just cheapen the currency by saying these actions are unacceptable. And frankly, I'm not even sure we've gone that far to say they're unacceptable. We have to do something. And Rich raises a very good point. I think they do this because they can get away with it, because we back down. We don't push back when they rhetorically slap a spokesman or the ambassador. Nobody comes to the defense of officials who speak out, whether it's American or European. The only one exception I would say, and I know Arzu wants to get in here, but I think it is worth noting, the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights Defenders, Michael Forst, issued a very strong statement at the beginning of this month talking about the I'm reading here now from a paper, and I'll do it briefly, relentless prosecution and repression of prominent rights activists in Azerbaijan. He called for their release, an end to all this prosecution and persecution before the games. So I give credit to people who are taking a firm stand, including people in the U.S. government. I don't want to suggest that everyone there is going silent, but it does matter the level that these issues are raised.
And if I may add, sort of building up on everything. So I think three things come to mind. First of all, when we compare this to 1988 to the Olympic Games, I mean, these are not Olympic Games to begin with. These are European Games. If you know, they were called European Olympic Games, and then all of a sudden the Olympic word dropped, and it just became first European Games in Europe. So I think I had no expectations when the idea of these games was announced to begin with that it will have any impact on Azerbaijan, and I have very little expectation now. And the reason why I have very little expectation is because we have the experience of the Eurovision, and this is the second point that I want to bring. Now, between Eurovision and the European Games, it's been 3 years, and there's been very little action, affirmative action, taken on behalf of the Western institutions, Western governments, to hold Azerbaijan responsible, because a lot has happened between the Eurovision Song Contest and the European Games. I mean, you look at the number of prisoners who went to the prison, you look at the number of newspapers that shut down, you look at the number of activists that were arrested and silenced, and you look at just the overall crackdown. The civil society, the foreign funding, the foreign organizations that were forced to leave the country, and still there are no affirmative, actions like sanctions or like more stronger action towards Azerbaijan. And so there's this games. I've seen how Eurovision had an impact on Azerbaijan. There was a spotlight for the month running up to the Eurovision, and for another few months, maybe after the Eurovision Song Contest was over, and then all of a sudden the spotlight faded because the Eurovision Song Contest left Azerbaijan, and the crackdown continued, and no one really paid attention to it. And now with the European Games, it's almost it's almost the same thing. There's a lot of attention to the run-up to the European Games, a lot of campaigns, a lot of statements, a lot of events are organized, and I'm really afraid that once the European Games are over, once the spotlight is gone, again, the crackdown and the level of crackdown, I'm really concerned how it will intensify, because I do have a feeling that it might get even worse. And the third point that I wanted to raise is the authoritarian regimes, the regimes that are hosting these games, being Olympics or the European Games, they've all been authoritarian when we look at this. And this is sending a really bad message to the next hosts, because there is no more hope almost that there will be a truly democratic country that would host it. Because really, when you look at these things are becoming really expensive. They're really, infrastructurally, it's really difficult to hold. So I wonder really whether we should actually stop and think for a moment whether we need these games, and whether we should actually start addressing other issues at stake, because it's not 1988 anymore. It's 2015. Governments have much bigger issues. The world has much bigger issues, and maybe instead of coming up with new ideas for games, international games, we should actually bring them down and address more serious issues at stake.
Can I just pick up on Arzu's point briefly, Brian? In democratic societies, there will not be support, at least in the U.S., I think, for public funding of all the facilities and expenses that would be incurred with hosting these games. So you have to look for private money, and there's a huge effort to look for that. Washington bid for these games. I'm very glad Washington was not chosen by the U.S. Olympic Committee, because it would be a nightmare here. On top of the resources devoted to finding outside funding. In authoritarian regimes, if they want to host them, if they want to spend the money, they make the decision. There's no public accountability. There's no parliament to act as a check and balance, so they get to spend their ill-gotten gains any way they want, including on what they deem to be these prestige events, and that's, I think, a major difference between the interest in democratic societies versus authoritarian societies.
David, I would add to that too that in these authoritarian societies, the line between what is public and what is private is very, very, very blurred. These games can be funded entirely by nominally private companies that are really.
The government of Azerbaijan is paying for the tickets of all the participants and the supporting teams. So it's a big cost on Azeri budget, on Azeri taxpayers, by the way. And I think there was a lot of focus on this is still European games, and it's a European matter. Of course, you talked about the reaction of the U.S. government, State Department, but I think also, Azerbaijan is part of this Council of Europe, and in a week, the Council of Europe will have its another summer session. And actually, Azerbaijan is, I believe, on agenda. There will be discussions on the human rights situation. you know, we joking when Azerbaijan joined the Council of Europe. People in Azerbaijan were so excited. They said, "Okay, we're going to European standards." But what happened now? People saying that European Council of Europe brought to the level of Azerbaijan standards. When it cannot, I mean, you can be member of Council of Europe, and you still have political prisoners. You have decision by the European Court for Human Rights. Government ignores it. I mean, Ilgar Mamedov is in jail. You have people who going to Council of Europe events, then coming back and going to jail in Azerbaijan. and Council of Europe says, what can we do? I mean, and they decided not to adopt the resolution, Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe on political prisoners, which government interpreted that as a, you know, as a ticket to go and jail anyone they want, because they say there is no definition of political prisoners, and that's what President Aliyev appealing very often. So I mean, and this is European games. I mean, Chancellor Merkel, she said she's not going. You know, she said she's busy, and that was a very strong message, in my opinion, to Baku and to other European leaders, also to be careful where they're planning to go and what kind of event they're going to attend. Of course, Putin immediately capitalized and said he's going to event. He even publicly criticized his own Russian state TV channels for not paying enough attention to this event. So why suddenly Putin is interested in these events, you know? And he's acting more and more like, you know, a boss of this region. And I think people in Baku also carefully watching what's happening. They're kind of running from one, you know, equation to another. So if this has European games, you know, European name on this event, I think EU, European, you know, Council of Europe, they should be also paying attention to the situation in Azerbaijan, not only the United States, I would say.
Arzu's absolutely right about, you know, trying to reduce the focus on events like this, because, you know, from a cost point of view and otherwise, it's really important. But there's, you know, there are two underlying trends, you know, at play here. One is the, you know, the idea of prestige by hosting events and meetings, and the other, which I think is so very, very clear to me, especially since past December, that Azerbaijan has chosen to move not closer to Europe and the West, but away. And the idea that somehow Russia and, you know, Putin's visit to Baku is part of this, that somehow Russia is a threat against which the U.S. needs to help Azerbaijan and ignore human rights, I think is completely false. I mean, Russia is less than a threat. The values that are being expressed by Putin are very compatible with the values that I see being expressed in Azerbaijan. So, you know, we've argued for a long time for a values-based relationship between the U.S. and the West and Azerbaijan. We have not succeeded in that. Russia has. And I think we should not kid ourselves that somehow, you know, these old arguments that we've been hearing for 2 decades apply in the current situation. Not only the games, but the game has changed.
So you see Azerbaijan drifting into Moscow's orbit on this, or I think they're playing a clever game of trying to between the West and Russia. But I also this is why this anti-American and anti-Western sentiment we're seeing in Azerbaijan, which is new, is a little bit puzzling to me.
But it's also largely, I mean, what happened in Ukraine, and I think the thinking in Baku that Putin is a new boss of the region, and they're trying, or at least it's, you know, or using the opportunity, like cracking down on the, let's say, pro-Western, pro-democracy groups, at the same time pleasing the Putin and telling him that we are actually with you on this issue. We don't want another Maidan here. We understand the threat may come from international organizations. So I think they're using this opportunity. I think there is no, I think, direct threat from Russia right now. But and the problem is the West and the United States kind of allows them to do that. because there is no pushback, which we discussed earlier before. And there soon will be nothing to support, to be honest. I mean, you're talking about crackdown may intensify. I see there is nothing to crack anymore. I mean, yes, now there is talk about censoring the Facebook. It comes from the chief of the organization. He's supposed to be on the side of free press, head of the press council. He's now talking about
blocking Facebook.
Blocking of, because there is some critical materials about the government. So that could be next stage, the moving to the social media, because the media, independent media, including RFRL, banned, almost banned in Azerbaijan, and internet is still relatively free. So I think that could be the next stage.
Well, yeah, if they're following Putin's
and
lead, that's not a good
and I don't think this is. I don't think Putin tells them to do this. I think this is just it's just very convenient, kind of model. They just copycat, and they have inflated sense of importance. I believe, we are too important for the West, too important for the United States, because we have gas and oil and stuff like that. And some people in the West let them believe that that's actually true, and they comfortable with these actions, and they're getting away with this, and they will continue this as long as they can get away, and there will be nobody is holding them accountable for this. At least, we talked about possibility of sanctions, possibility of serious kind of statements, at least, pushback. They don't see it, and so they feel like it's comfortable.
Well, also, I wanted to add. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
About Azerbaijan's relationship with, Aliyev's relationship with Putin, really, because, I mean, when you look at the history of criticisms that Azerbaijani government has raised, and you compare how much criticism Azerbaijan has done with the West and how much criticism has done with Russia, it will be like 0 to 100, and 0 being Russia, because Azerbaijan has never, to this day, raised any critical statement about Putin or some kind of policy or anything on the relationship. They're playing a very balanced game. They're obviously, the conflict with Armenia is a big role in this, but also Aliyev, for Aliyev, Russia is a completely different playing field. It's a very different game, and the West, for him, like the US and Europe, is all in this like a different bundle, which he deals with completely differently. And I think it's also has to do with the tradition of power in general within the Western world and Russia, and how Azerbaijan is trying to be very careful with Russia and a lot more confident, I would say, with the West.
One last thing I wanted to throw out before we wrap it up is it's impossible to have a discussion about the European Games and about a sporting event without talking about not talking about the FIFA scandal, but referring to the FIFA scandal. I mean, this scandal is creating unprecedented scrutiny on World Cup bids right now. The Russia 2018 bid is under scrutiny. The Qatar 2022 not bid, but they're winning the bid, are all under scrutiny. It's no secret that there's a lot of corruption around all of these events. Will this scrutiny lead to more scrutiny, and will maybe reverse this trend of these games being awarded to places like Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan?
Well, we need more U.S. investigators.
Swiss investigators.
That really is the key point to take away from this FIFA thing. I mean, the details of the corruption are significant here, but the reach of U.S. law to people who are using the U.S. financial system to make transactions is impressive, let me put it that way. And I think people who are involved in things like Olympics or European Games, who are working through the U.S. financial system as part of their activities, need to be very, very careful. It may not happen tomorrow, but I think here's another instrument, David, in addition to targeted sanctions on travel and assets, that is there as an instrument if the U.S. and maybe even other countries are prepared to use it. And I think at a minimum, those who are running countries like Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan need to be very, very careful, because they may, in fact, at some point, end up with a summons in the mail for violation of U.S. law.
I mean, we talked about FIFA, but UEFA, European Football Association, awarded Azerbaijan to host, I believe, quarterfinal or semi-final games for 2020 European Football Championship. And SOCAR, state oil company of Azerbaijan, is one of the major sponsors of 2020 European Football Championship. So, I'm just saying, how did they get this deal? Of course, that's a question for Michel Platini, who is the head of UEFA, who was one of the critics of the Blatter.
Blatter, yeah.
But these questions, I think this is the questions for journalists, for the society, for civil society, should be on the table. Yes. Again, as I said, Azeris love football, love sporting events. I'm personally a big football fan, and I like to see Baku hosting these events. But what is behind these deals? What is behind these deals? We need to know more. We need to have more information. How these deals were made, who is granting these deals, how this transaction works, And if it requires more U.S. investigators on these cases, I mean.
Well,
we will be only happy.
Let's hope not just U.S. I mean, the Europeans have banks too, and in a lot of ways, the Swiss have pioneered this. I mean, if you remember when Carlo Del Ponte was the Swiss prosecutor, they pioneered this in the 90s. They indicted several Russian officials for corruption using the Swiss banking system. So if the European Union and the United States both get together on this, the reach could be incredible, and they'll have no place to go because the money's got to go through some Western banking system. One would assume, yeah. So
I think there will be more scrutiny. I think the FIFA corruption case created a precedent, and I think there will be more scrutiny. Who is getting these games? Which country is getting these deals? And I think that's a positive sign. And actually, it's actually great that it happened, and that's a very well. I mean, the excellent example for the future.
That's a good positive note to wrap up on. Unless anybody else has anything they want to throw in before we call it a day. All right, that's about all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been watching RFERL Live. My name is Brian Whitmore, host of the Power Vertical podcast here at RFERL. Joining me here in Prague has been Kenan Aliyev, executive editor of Current Time, a Russian-language news program run by RFERL and the Voice of America. Joining us from Budapest has been journalist and blogger Arzu Gaibula, who's written extensively about political prisoners in Azerbaijan. And joining us from Arlington, Virginia has been Richard Kozlarich, former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan as well as to Bosnia-Herzegovina, and currently adjunct professor at George Mason University. And joining us from Washington, D.C. has been David Kramer, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs and currently Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy at the McCain Institute. Thank you all for a fascinating discussion.
Thanks very much.
And thanks to everybody out there in Google Land for joining us.